Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases ever recorded in the Missouri Ozarks. Before we start, I'd like you to tell me in the comments where you're watching from and the precise time you're hearing this story. We're always curious to learn what locations and at which hours of the day or night these historical accounts find their audience. During the winter of 1912, a small notice concerning a family disturbance in Tenney County, deep within the Ozark Mountains, was printed by the Springfield Republican newspaper. The piece, hardly 3 paragraphs in length, noted that local authorities had been summoned to look into the disappearance of a woman, Eliza Whitlock, from her secluded homestead near the White River. Her husband, Thomas Whitlock, claimed she had departed willingly after a domestic quarrel. The newspaper reported. The article wrapped up by stating that no further inquiry was considered necessary at the moment. What went unmentioned by the newspaper was that this short report would mark the start of one of Ozark history's most disturbing cases, one destined to stay largely unrecorded for many decades. The Whitlock property occupied roughly 40 acres of rocky hillside, close to the tiny settlement of Walnut Shade, about 15 miles south of Forsyth, the Tenney County seat. The homestead was made up of a 2-story timber frame house, a modest barn, and a handful of outbuildings. County documents from 1908 show that Thomas Whitlock purchased the land after relocating from Springfield, where he'd been employed as a clerk at the Here's department store. These records described Thomas as a man of quiet nature and particular routines. His wife, Eliza, formerly Eliza Crawford, had taught school in Christian County before they wed in 1905. They shared 2 children, Edward, who was 6 in 1912, and Mary, age 4. Neighbors would later remember the Whitlocks as a reserved family, seldom joining in community gatherings. Thomas would occasionally make trips into Forsyth or Branson for necessities, but after their first year of residence, Eliza was rarely spotted outside the boundaries of their land. Such seclusion wasn't strange for the region, where homesteads could sit miles apart, divided by thick oak and pine forests, limestone bluffs, and steep hollows. The Ozarks had always been a place individuals came to vanish into, whether escaping the law, debt, or merely society itself. Joseph Miller, whose family owned the neighboring property to the east, stated the Whitlocks seemed fairly content in their initial years on the homestead. Interviewed in 1952 by a Missouri Historical Society researcher, Miller recalled that Thomas was fastidious about his property lines and mostly kept to himself, but would offer a nod of greeting when our paths intersected. The missus was even more withdrawn, yet the children appeared healthy and suitably dressed. Miller observed that around the fall of 1911, roughly half a year before Eliza vanished, Thomas began upgrading the property, which included digging what seemed to be a new root cellar behind the house and adding extra locks to the doors. The final confirmed sighting of Eliza Whitlock by anyone outside the nuclear family occurred in November 1911, when Harriet Bowman, a midwife from Walnut Shade, came to the homestead after getting word that Eliza was unwell. In a statement delivered to the Tenney County Sheriff in April 1912, Bowman reported finding Eliza pale and detached, with a nervous manner, though she suffered from no obvious physical illness. According to Bowman, The house felt unnaturally cold, even with the fireplace burning, and Thomas stayed in the room for the entire visit, fielding most questions directed at his wife. When Bowman proposed that a trip to the doctor in Forsyth might help Eliza, Thomas allegedly responded that the family couldn't afford such a cost and that rest would restore his wife. County records show that throughout the autumn of 1911, Thomas Whitlock had been making regular withdrawals from the family's small savings at the Tenney County Bank. Ledgers kept in the county archives reveal that between September and December of that year, Thomas pulled out almost half of the family's savings. The bank manager, Harold Winters, later remembered Thomas explaining these withdrawals as essential for home improvements and readying for winter. Winters observed that while such spending wasn't unusual for homesteaders bracing for an Ozark winter, the sum seemed excessive for a family of the Whitlocks' limited means. The winter of 1911 to 1912 proved especially brutal in the Ozarks. Heavy snow in December and January cut off many remote homesteads for weeks at a stretch, and it was common for families to have no outside contact until early spring. Weather records maintained by the Springfield Weather Bureau show that temperatures in February 1912 plunged near 0 degrees Fahrenheit several times, and snow covered the ground for inches deep until mid-March. The isolation forced by these weather conditions meant odd activities could escape a neighbor's notice for long stretches. Sometime during this period of isolation, between late February and early March 1912, Eliza Whitlock reportedly left her family. The precise date of her disappearance was never firmly determined. Thomas Whitlock first brought up his wife's absence to Joseph Miller in late March, when Miller met him on the road to Forsyth. In his 1952 account, Miller said Thomas stated plainly that the missus has gone away and volunteered nothing more. Used to his neighbor's reserved nature, Miller didn't probe further. Archival materials from the general store in Forsyth indicate that Thomas Whitlock's buying habits shifted markedly in early March 1912. Store ledgers reveal that on March 4th, he purchased an unusually large stock of preserved foods, coffee, and lamp oil, supplies adequate to maintain a household for many weeks without a return trip to town. The store owner, Jeremiah Collins, recorded in a personal journal found among his effects after his 1938 death that Thomas seemed agitated and disinclined to engage in casual conversation during that visit. Collins wrote that he asked about Mrs. Whitlock's health, to which Thomas replied curtly that she is not my concern at present. The matter might have stayed entirely a private affair, if not for the intervention of Eliza's sister, Catherine Crawford, a Springfield resident who had received no word from Eliza since the prior autumn. Letters kept in the Tenney County Historical Society archives show that Catherine wrote to the Walnut Shade postmaster in early April 1912, asking after her sister's well-being. After the postmaster told her that Eliza had allegedly left her family, Catherine journeyed to Tenney County and asked Sheriff James Harmon to look into the disappearance. Catherine Crawford's personal journal, gifted to the Missouri State Archives by her granddaughter in 1961, offers a window into her worries about her sister's circumstances. In a passage dated April 10, 1912, Catherine wrote, "I cannot believe that Eliza would leave her children willingly. Since her marriage to Thomas, her letters had grown increasingly infrequent and guarded. But her devotion to Edward and Mary was evident in every word she wrote about them. Something is terribly wrong, and I fear what I might discover in Tenney County. Sheriff Harmon's formal report, dated April 18, 1912, details his trip to the Whitlock homestead. Harmon reported discovering the property well kept, with Thomas and both children there. The children looked suitably fed and dressed, though Harmon observed that both were remarkably silent during his time there. Thomas insisted Eliza had left of her own accord after voicing dissatisfaction with their secluded life, taking only a small valise of personal belongings. He professed to have no idea of her whereabouts but speculated she might have gone to her family in Springfield, even though Catherine insisted her sister had contacted no relatives. Harmon's report contains a short account of his house inspection, which turned up no evidence of a disturbance or struggle. He observed that Eliza's clothing and personal effects seemed to be gone from the bedroom drawers, backing up Thomas's assertion that she had packed before departing. The sheriff decided there was insufficient proof of foul play, and that as an adult, Eliza possessed the right to leave her family if she wished. With Catherine Crawford's reluctant agreement to this finding, the official investigation closed. What Harmon's report omitted, but what surfaced in his private papers found after his 1931 death, was that he had spotted several troubling details during his time at the Whitlock property. In a private notebook apart from his official records, Harmon penned, "Whitlock was too composed for a man recently abandoned." The children watched their father's face before answering any question, no matter how innocuous. The boy began to speak about his mother, but stopped abruptly when Thomas cleared his throat. Most troubling was the fresh-turned earth behind the house, which Whitlock claimed was a garden plot, though it was an odd time for planting and shaped more like a trench than a garden bed. Harmon's private notes imply he held suspicions about Thomas Whitlock, but didn't have enough evidence to chase them. The sheriff wrote, "Without a body or a witness, there is no crime to investigate. Mrs. Crawford's concerns, while understandable, do not constitute proof. In these hills, family matters are generally considered private, and the county lacks resources for extended investigations based on mere suspicion." This hesitancy to step in without solid proof mirrored the limited reach of law enforcement and the cultural norms of rural Missouri in the early 1900s. Catherine Crawford went back to Springfield after her talk with Sheriff Harmon, yet her worries about her sister's fate lingered. Her journal shows she tried to keep in touch with her niece and nephew by mailing letters and little gifts, but only got brief, stiff acknowledgments back from Thomas. In June 1912, she journeyed once more to Tenney County, hoping to see the children, but Thomas turned her away, telling her that her presence upset the household's routine. Catherine's final journal entry on the subject, dated July 3, 1912, states, "I fear I have failed Eliza. Without proof or legal standing, I cannot force my way into Thomas's home or remove the children. I can only pray that if Eliza is alive somewhere, she will find her way back to them, or at least to me." For a number of years, Eliza Whitlock's disappearance stayed a private sorrow, known only to her immediate family and a few locals. Thomas carried on running the homestead, bringing up his children with occasional help from a local woman, Martha Jenkins, who arrived to assist with housework several times weekly. Jenkins, who started working at the Whitlock home in the summer of 1912, later confided to a neighbor that Thomas had ordered her never to talk about Eliza with the children, and to tell them, if they inquired, that their mother would come back when she was better. Jenkins was interviewed briefly by Sheriff Masterson during the 1952 probe. By then an elderly woman residing in a Branson nursing home, she remembered several strange aspects of her time at the Whitlock home. The transcript of this interview, held in the county archives, shows Jenkins stated that Thomas had laid down firm rules about certain parts of the property that were off limits. He would not allow anyone near the root cellar he had built, she said. Once when young Mary wandered toward it, Thomas grabbed her so roughly that she cried out. He later apologized, saying there were dangerous tools stored there that might harm the children. Jenkins also mentioned that Thomas often battled insomnia and would pace the house through the night. On multiple mornings, she arrived to find him seated at the kitchen table, seemingly having been up all night, muttering about keeping watch and maintaining the barriers. Jenkins confessed she found these actions worrying, but chalked them up to the strain of raising two children solo. Like many in the area, she was hesitant to meddle in what she saw as private family business. Edward and Mary Whitlock started attending the one-room Walnut Shade Schoolhouse in 1913. Their teacher, Abigail Thornton, recorded in her private diary that both children were unusually withdrawn, and Edward especially showed a troubling tendency to fall into long silences. Thornton documented an incident from October 1913, when a female school visitor tried to talk to Mary about her mother. According to Thornton, Mary grew visibly upset, and later that day, Thomas Whitlock showed up at the school, pulled both children out, and kept them home for almost 2 weeks. Thornton's diary, held privately until given to the Tenney County Historical Society in 1965, holds several other notes on the Whitlock children. She observed that Edward often came to school with dark circles under his eyes, explaining that the noises kept him awake at night. Pressed on what noises he referred to, the boy wouldn't elaborate. Mary, though younger, seemed to adjust more easily to school, but displayed what Thornton called an unusual preoccupation with burial. The teacher recorded finding a set of drawings in Mary's desk, showing what looked to be a figure lying underground, with flowers sprouting above. In the spring of 1914, according to Thornton's diary, Edward Whitlock's conduct grew more alarming. He started having what the teacher termed episodes, stretches when he'd become unresponsive, staring vacantly at nothing. After one such episode, during which Edward had whispered over and over, "She's still digging," Thornton tried to discuss the boy's well-being with Thomas. Her diary entry for April 12, 1914, reads, "Mr. Whitlock received my concerns with cold anger. He informed me that his son's education was his business, and my observations were unwelcome. I fear for these children, but what can I do, Mr. Whitlock has threatened to remove them from school permanently if I pursue the matter." The Whitlock family persisted in their solitary life until 1917, when Thomas sold the homestead suddenly and relocated with the children to Kansas City. County records show the property was sold to James Harker, an Arkansas cattle rancher, for far less than its assessed worth. Harker later told neighbors that Thomas appeared desperate to wrap up the sale fast and had taken the first offer given. The Whitlock family's exit coincided with mounting attention from local officials. Tenney County School Board records, unearthed during the 1952 inquiry, revealed that Abigail Thornton had at last reported her worries about the Whitlock children to the county superintendent in March 1917. The superintendent had then started an inquiry, sending Thomas a letter asking for a meeting about the children's welfare. Post office records show this letter reached him on April 3, 1917. Thomas put the property on the market the very next day and finished the deal by month's end. James Harker, who bought the Whitlock place, made several changes to the homestead, including tearing down what was left of the root cellar behind the house. In a statement to investigators in 1952, Harker's son, William, recalled his father describing the cellar as peculiar, deeper than needed for storing vegetables, and split into sections by internal walls. William Harker stated that his father had uncovered several odd items during the demolition, including a woman's hairbrush with dark hairs still caught in the bristles, buried about 2 feet beneath the cellar floor. According to William, his father hadn't thought much of the find then, figuring it was just discarded household trash. The Harker family kept the former Whitlock property until 1933, when the Great Depression forced them to sell. The homestead cycled through several owners over the next 2 decades, slowly deteriorating as the original structures aged and newer residents concentrated on other parts of the land. By 1950, the house was mostly abandoned, with local teens sometimes using it as a hangout, sparking rumors that the property was haunted by a weeping woman whose cries could sometimes be heard on still nights. For the next several decades, the story of Eliza Whitlock's disappearance slipped from local memory. The family's move from the area, along with the upheaval of World War I and the flu pandemic that followed, pushed the unresolved matter into darkness. It might have stayed there forever, if not for a find made in 1952, when the former Whitlock property, by then deserted and overgrown, was bought by Walter and Ruth Simmons, a St. Louis couple aiming to build a hunting lodge. A report filed with the Tenney County Sheriff's Department on June 12, 1952, says the Simmons were clearing brush behind the decaying house when they found what looked like the collapsed entrance to an old root cellar or storage area. On closer look, they discovered a small leather-bound book wedged between 2 limestone blocks that had formed the cellar's foundation. The book, badly damaged by moisture and age, was identified as Eliza Whitlock's personal diary, with entries spanning January 1910 to February 1912. Ruth Simmons, who first spotted the diary, later recalled her initial impression of the book in an interview with the Springfield News Leader. The pages were stuck together, and much of the ink had run, but you could still make out the handwriting in places. What struck me immediately was the change in the writer's penmanship over time. The early entries were neat and controlled, while the later ones became increasingly erratic, as if written by someone in a state of agitation or fear. Finding the diary spurred a renewed inquiry by Sheriff William Masterson. The diary's contents, partially readable despite the damage, unveiled a harrowing tale of Eliza Whitlock's last years. The entries, which began by chronicling ordinary aspects of rural existence, gradually shifted to voice Eliza's growing alarm over her husband's behavior. In an entry dated August 14, 1911, she wrote, "He watches constantly, says the house is not secure enough, speaks of dangers I cannot see. When I suggested visiting my sister, his face changed in a way I cannot describe." Another entry from October 3, 1911, stated, "The children are forbidden to wander beyond the yard now. He has nailed shut the window in our bedroom. Says it is to keep out the cold. But the first frost has not even come." The diary's most worrying entries started in November 1911, aligning with Harriet Bowman's visit. Eliza wrote, "The midwife came today. I wanted to speak freely, but could not with him standing there listening to every word. When she left, T said no one else would be permitted to enter our house. He says they bring contamination from town." In December, she recorded, "The new room beneath the house is nearly completed. T works on it when he thinks I am asleep. He speaks of it as a sanctuary, but it feels more like a tomb." A particularly unsettling entry, dated January 8, 1912, reads, "I found Edward this morning, standing at the entrance to the cellar, staring at the door. When I asked what he was doing, he said, 'Father says we'll all sleep there soon when the time comes.' When I questioned T about this, he became enraged, accusing me of turning the children against him. He did not leave my side for the remainder of the day." As January wore on, Eliza's entries grew shorter and more disjointed. On January 23rd, she wrote, "The tonic he prepares each evening. It leaves me groggy and confused the next day. I began pouring it into my potted plant when he isn't looking. The plant died within days." Another entry, dated February 2nd, simply states, "I must get the children away from here. But how? The snow is deep and we are miles from town. T has hidden my boots and coat. He says it is to prevent me from falling ill, but I know the truth." The final legible entry, dated February 17, 1912, held only 3 lines. "He found these pages tonight. His rage was terrible. The children are locked in their room. I hear him digging again." Based on the diary's contents, Sheriff Masterson ordered the area where the root cellar had stood to be excavated. On June 18, 1952, investigators dug up human remains, later matched through dental records to Eliza Whitlock. A medical examination concluded she had sustained blunt force trauma to the skull before being buried. The body's position indicated she'd been placed face down in a shallow grave, her hands bound behind her back with wire. Dr. Lawrence Wilson, the medical examiner who performed the autopsy on Eliza's remains, flagged several extra details in his report. Wilson established that Eliza had been around 32 years old at death, matching her known age. He also uncovered evidence of a previous fracture to her left wrist that had mended before she died, an injury never mentioned in any known records. Most significantly, Wilson detected traces of a sedative compound in the preserved tissue samples, hinting that Eliza may have been drugged before her death. This discovery backed up her diary entries about the tonic Thomas had forced her to drink. Following the find, authorities tried to track down Thomas Whitlock and his children. But the inquiry revealed that Thomas had died in a Kansas City hospital in 1931 from pneumonia complications. Edward Whitlock had been killed in action in World War II in 1944. Only Mary Whitlock, by then Mary Coleman, was still living, residing in Omaha, Nebraska, with her husband and 3 children. Records from the Kansas City Public Library, checked during the investigation, offered some details about the Whitlock family's life after departing Tenney County. City directories showed Thomas had worked as a night watchman at a warehouse from 1917 until 1928, when health issues compelled him to retire. Edward had attended school through the 8th grade before landing a job at the same warehouse. Neighbors from that era, located by investigators, described Thomas as a stern father who stuck to himself but wasn't especially unusual in his conduct. One former neighbor, Estelle Parker, recalled that Thomas never talked about his late wife and grew agitated if anyone asked about the children's mother. Mary Whitlock had married Richard Coleman, an insurance salesman, in 1929 and relocated to Omaha soon after. Marriage records show she listed her mother as deceased on the application, though no death certificate for Eliza existed at that point. This implied that either Thomas had told his daughter her mother was dead, or Mary herself had decided to describe her absent mother in this way. Contacted by Missouri authorities in July 1952, Mary Coleman claimed to have no memory of the events around her mother's disappearance. She said her father had always told her that her mother had deserted the family, and she'd had no cause to doubt that story. However, Coleman's husband later reached out to investigators in private, reporting that his wife endured recurring nightmares about a woman calling from beneath the floorboards, and had always shown an extreme terror of enclosed spaces. Richard Coleman supplied investigators with more insight into his wife's psychological state. In a letter kept in the case file, he wrote, "Mary has suffered from what doctors now call anxiety attacks throughout our marriage. These episodes are often triggered by certain sounds, particularly the sound of digging or scraping, or by the sight of certain objects, including gardening tools and root cellars. For years, she has refused to enter our basement or any underground space. When I asked about the origin of these fears, she would become distant and change the subject." The investigation dug up more details through interviews with former Tenney County residents who had known the Whitlock family. Clara Jensen, a young girl living near Walnut Shade in 1912, recalled her father once running into Thomas Whitlock in Forsyth, buying an odd amount of quicklime from the hardware store. When asked about the purchase, Thomas had explained it was to seal the root cellar walls against dampness. Jensen also remembered hearing her parents talk about strange sounds drifting from the Whitlock property late at night that winter. Sounds her father had blamed on wild animals or the wind in the hollow. Jensen's brother Harold gave a written statement describing a meeting he'd had with Edward Whitlock in the spring of 1912. According to this statement, Harold had run into Edward near the property line dividing their family's land. The Whitlock boy had seemed upset and asked Harold if people could hear things through the ground. When Harold asked what he meant, Edward had replied, "Father says no one can hear anything through the ground once it's packed down tight, but I think I can still hear her sometimes." Before Harold could ask more, Thomas Whitlock appeared, calling his son home. Harold had mentioned the odd chat to his parents, but they dismissed it as childish imagination. Deeper digging into Thomas Whitlock's past turned up a possible reason for his increasingly paranoid actions in the months before Eliza vanished. Records from the State Lunatic Asylum in Nevada, Missouri, now called the Nevada State Hospital, showed that Thomas's father, William Whitlock, had been committed to the institution in 1890 after displaying violent paranoid delusions. The elder Whitlock had supposedly grown convinced his wife was scheming against him with neighbors and had tried to lock her up in their home. Hospital records show William Whitlock died in the asylum in 1902, with notes pointing to a hereditary tendency toward paranoid ideation. The asylum records also held a letter from Thomas's mother, Sarah Whitlock, penned to the hospital director in 1895. In this letter, she voiced worry about her son's nervous temperament and asked if her husband's condition could be passed to their children. The director's reply, also saved in the file, reassured Sarah that mental aberrations are not necessarily inherited, but advised that Thomas should be steered toward work that avoided extreme stress or isolation, hinting that some familial predisposition toward mental illness was recognized even back then. In October 1952, Professor Alan Matthews, a historian studying Ozark folklore at the University of Missouri, visited the former Whitlock property at the new owner's invitation. Matthews mapped out the homestead's layout and the spot where Eliza's remains had been unearthed. His notes, kept in the university archives, capture the property's secluded nature. The homestead sits in a narrow valley surrounded on three sides by steep wooded slopes. Even at midday, parts of the yard remain in shadow. The nearest neighbor's house, though less than a mile away, as the crow flies, is invisible from the Whitlock property due to the intervening terrain. A person could scream here without being heard beyond these hills. Matthews also logged local legends that had sprung up around the property in the years after the Whitlocks left. Several Walnut Shade residents said they steered clear of the area, claiming that those passing the abandoned homestead at night sometimes heard a woman weeping or the sound of digging. Matthews observed that such tales were common for many desert Ozark properties, but hinted that in this instance they might have sprung from real sounds heard by passersby during the winter of 1911 to 1912. In his field journal, Matthews wrote, "The acoustic properties of this valley are unusual. Standing at the former site of the root cellar, I conducted a simple experiment, dropping stones into the remaining depression and noting how the sound carried. Even a small impact produces an echo that reverberates between the limestone bluffs. It occurs to me that if someone were digging in this location at night, when ambient noise is reduced, the sound might indeed travel considerable distances, creating the impression of ghostly activity to those unfamiliar with the terrain." The Eliza Whitlock case was formally shut in December 1952. Her death ruled a homicide pinned on Thomas Whitlock. Her remains were laid to rest in the Springfield Cemetery, where her parents and sister were buried. The story got brief attention in regional papers, but was swiftly buried by bigger national events. The Tenney County Historical Society keeps a modest file on the case, with copies of the original sheriff's reports, passages from Eliza's diary, and newspaper clippings tied to the 1952 find. Among these items is a transcript of an interview with Richard Anderson, who served as a deputy sheriff under James Harmon in 1912. Anderson, in his late 70s during the 1952 inquiry, recalled that Sheriff Harmon had stayed haunted by the Whitlock case long after the official probe ended. According to Anderson, Harmon brought up the case several times over the years, once observing that sometimes the law's limitations mean that justice must wait. Anderson felt certain Harmon had suspected foul play, but didn't have the proof or means to follow the case further. In 1968, the last major turn in the Whitlock case came when Mary Coleman's eldest son, Robert, wrote the Tennessee County Historical Society, asking for information about his grandparents. Letters in the Society's archives show Robert had recently found his mother's stash of childhood drawings tucked away in their attic after she died of cancer earlier that year. The drawings, made when Mary was between 5 and 8, showed a repeating scene, a small female figure beneath what seemed to be floorboards or earth, with stick figures standing above. One drawing, labeled in a child's scrawl with the words, "Mama sleeping," depicted a similar scene with what looked like a man digging. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, a psychologist who studied the drawings at the Historical Society's request, provided a written analysis, now kept in the case file. Mitchell noted the drawings showed several traits typical of children who've lived through trauma, including repetition of upsetting themes, heavy pressure when drawing certain elements, especially the lines symbolizing the ground or floor, and the placement of figures in trapped or buried poses, Mitchell concluded. These drawings strongly suggest that the child who created them witnessed or was aware of a deeply disturbing event involving the burial of a female figure, presumably her mother. The consistency of the imagery across multiple drawings indicates that this was not a momentary fantasy, but a persistent memory or preoccupation. Robert Coleman visited the former Whitlock property in the summer of 1968, by which point the original house had been knocked down and replaced with the hunting lodge. In a letter to the Historical Society after his trip, he wrote, "Standing on that ground, I felt a profound sense of sorrow, not just for the grandmother I never knew, but for my mother, who carried this buried truth her entire life. Some secrets refuse to remain hidden, no matter how deeply they are buried." Coleman went on to portray his mother as a caring parent, but always somewhat removed, as if a piece of her stayed locked in that Ozark Valley. He shared that Mary had refused to talk about her childhood and had reacted with odd anxiety when her children inquired about their maternal grandparents. "Now I understand why," Coleman penned. "She was protecting us from a truth she herself could not fully face. That her father, the man who raised her, had murdered her mother and forced her to become complicit in a lifetime of silence." The Whitlock case stands as an example of a pattern criminologists would later spot in many rural communities. The way seclusion and privacy can let domestic violence spiral without interference. In the early 20th century Ozarks, where homesteads sat apart, divided by rough land, and cultural habits frowned on meddling in family business, a woman like Eliza Whitlock had few ways out once her husband's mind began to fracture. The closest neighbor was miles off, and winter weather rendered travel all but impossible. Even when concerns were voiced, as by the midwife Harriet Bowman or teacher Abigail Thornton, the slim resources and reach of local authorities made real help unlikely. Professor Matthews, in a paper printed in the Journal of Ozark Studies in 1954, used the Whitlock case to shine a light on broader trends in rural crime and community reaction. He pointed out that Thomas Whitlock's position as the male head of household gave him near total control over his family in the community's eyes. Neighbors who may have spotted red flags were loath to step in, sticking to the rule that a man's home is his castle. Matthews argued this blend of physical seclusion and cultural insulation bred conditions where family violence could happen with little chance of discovery or repercussion. The psychological mark left on the Whitlock children is another facet of the case that has earned academic interest. Dr. Mitchell, in her study of Mary's drawings, proposed that the little girl had built a complex defense mechanism to cope with the trauma she'd endured. Rather than confronting the impossible truth of her father's acts, Mitchell wrote, Mary seems to have sealed off the experience, crafting a psychological wall between her conscious mind and the truth she grasped on some level. This shattering of memory is a recognized response to childhood trauma, letting the person go on functioning, but at the price of full psychological wholeness. Now the old Whitlock property is part of a bigger recreational tract. Hardly any visitors know the story of that specific plot of ground, or the sad events that played out there. The limestone bluffs still throw long shadows over the valley, and at dusk, when the breeze stirs through the hollow, some claim it carries echoes of the past, sounds that could be taken for a woman's far off voice calling from somewhere underneath the earth. What renders the Eliza Whitlock case so deeply unsettling isn't just the way she died, but the silent consent that let her disappearance go unchecked for so long. In the tight, knit but isolated communities of the early 20th century Ozarks, privacy was prized, and poking into family affairs was generally avoided. This cultural bent towards staying out of it forged a space where someone could effectively disappear with barely a question asked. The diary unearthed in 1952 gives us the only peek into Eliza's world during those last months. Her swelling fear as her husband's mind crumbled, her worry for her children's well-being, and her deepening seclusion from the outside world. The entries paint a picture of a woman who saw her peril but found herself caught by both her physical setting and the social rules that offered scant defense to wives and mothers. Maybe the most haunting piece is the legacy of quiet that stretched on long after Eliza's death. Her children, Mary especially, seemed to have interred their memories right alongside their mother, erecting mental walls that shielded them from facing what was real. When Mary's drawings surfaced after her death, they proved that some corner of her mind had always held the truth, that it had bled out through her art, even as it stayed unvoiced in her life. Local historian Margaret Branson, who has pored over the Whitlock case at length, noted in a 2012 article marking the centennial of Eliza's vanishing, what unfolded in that lonely valley was not simply the murder of a woman by her mentally ill husband, but the murder of truth itself. Thomas Whitlock buried his wife twice. First in the dirt behind their house, and then inside a story that wiped away her existence and swapped it with desertion. The children, too young to grasp everything, but old enough to sense something was dreadfully off, were pushed into playing along with this lie, hauling the weight of an unspoken truth their entire lives. The case stands as a reminder that the deepest horrors often don't erupt in sudden flashes of violence, but in the slow crumbling of safety, in the step-by-step shift of home into prison, and in the awful hush that can fall when those meant to shield us morph into our greatest danger. In the deep hollows of the Ozarks, where sound bends oddly and darkness settles early, Eliza Whitlock's story serves as a reminder that the real monsters aren't ghosts or spirits, but everyday humans whose minds have twisted against them and against those they once held dear. For those who examine such cases, the Whitlock tragedy shows how isolation can swell mental illness, how cultural habits can permit abuse, and how truth, regardless of how carefully it's hidden, eventually claws its way to the surface. In the many decades since Eliza's remains were brought to light, forensic psychology has honed tools that might have spotted Thomas Whitlock's crumbling mind before it erupted in bloodshed, and laws have shifted to give more protection to possible victims. Still, parallel stories keep playing out in lonely places where privacy can still act as a cover for the unspeakable. The limestone dirt of the Ozarks at last coughed up what Thomas Whitlock strove to hide. But for 40 years, Eliza lay forgotten in her unmarked grave, her fate a secret to everyone save the man who placed her there and, perhaps, the children who toted the weight of that knowledge inside their nightmares and their quiet. In that quiet sits the true horror of the Whitlock case, a silence that said everything to those ready to listen. Dr. Samuel Hers, a forensic psychiatrist who combed through the case files in 1960 for a piece in the American Journal of Psychiatry, put forward that Thomas Whitlock likely battled what we'd now label paranoid schizophrenia, much like his father's illness. Hirsch remarked that the rise of Thomas's symptoms seemed to track the disorder's classic path, with first signs in his late 20s or early 30s, slowly ramping up in intensity. The forward march of his paranoia, starting with broad distrust of neighbors, swelling into fears about his home's security, and ending in the conviction that his wife was somehow tainted or a threat, matches known patterns of unmanaged psychosis. What sets the Whitlock tragedy apart from many parallel cases, Hirsch contended, was the long span of time Thomas kept up a mask of normalcy after erasing the perceived danger. Most familicide cases wrap up with the perpetrator's own suicide or quick capture. Hirsch wrote, Whitlock's ability to create and sustain an alternative narrative that his wife had abandoned the family and to function in society for nearly 2 decades afterward suggests a complicated relationship between his delusions and his awareness of social norms. He knew enough to hide his actions and create a plausible cover story, indicating that some part of him recognized that what he had done would be condemned by others. The children's reaction to the trauma they saw or sensed has drawn special focus from psychologists examining the case. Edward Whitlock's school files, pulled during the 1952 probe, trace a pattern of slipping grades and rising behavioral troubles after his mother vanished. His teacher logged instances of what would now be called dissociative episodes, moments when he'd grow unresponsive or seem to listen to sounds no one else could detect. These signs hint that Edward may have developed what today's clinicians would term post-traumatic stress disorder. Mary Whitlock's response veered from her brother's in important ways. Where Edward showed clearer signs of strain, Mary seemed to adjust more fluidly to their new reality. Dr. Mitchell proposed that Mary's younger age at the time of the trauma may have helped her seal off her experiences. Children of 3 to 4 years old are still forming their grasp of permanence and cause, Mitchell penned in her analysis. Mary may have been better able to accept the narrative her father presented because her cognitive framework was still forming. However, as her drawings reveal, the truth remained present in her unconscious mind, emerging through her artwork in ways she could not verbally express. The lasting toll of childhood trauma is further underlined by Mary's adult life. Per her husband's words to investigators, she showed several traits common to adult survivors of childhood trauma: persistent anxiety, specific phobias linked to the traumatic event, especially her terror of tight spaces, an aversion to the sound of digging, and emotional numbness. Richard Coleman described his wife as affectionate, but somehow vacant, as if a piece of her lingered elsewhere. This fracturing of awareness, the skill of functioning normally in most of life, while sealing off traumatic memories, is a known survival trick in trauma psychology. The ripple of trauma across generations is hinted at by Robert Coleman's account of his mother's parenting. In his letters to the Historical Society, he observed that Mary was fiercely overprotective of her children, to the point of sparking fights with his father. She would become irrationally anxious if we were out of her sight for even short periods, he wrote. And she had strict rules about certain activities. We were never allowed to play in the basement, for instance, or to dig holes in the yard beyond a certain depth. At the time, these seemed like arbitrary restrictions, but now I understand they were connected to her own buried experiences. The community's handling of the Whitlock case mirrors broader social trends regarding family violence and mental illness in early 20th century rural America. When Sheriff Harmon looked into Eliza's disappearance in 1912, he worked inside a legal and cultural frame that put a high premium on family privacy and male rule. Domestic violence was largely treated as a private issue, not a crime calling for public interference. Lacking clear signs of foul play, and with Thomas offering a believable story for his wife's absence, Harmon had scant basis to press the inquiry further, whatever his private misgivings. In the same way, the neighbors who spotted troubling shifts in Thomas's conduct, his deepening solitude, the odd additions to his land, his restless air in town, filtered these clues through the worldview of their era. Mental illness was barely grasped and deeply stigmatized, often pinned on moral flaws or spiritual lapses rather than medical conditions needing care. A family's retreat from community life might prompt a raised eyebrow, but wasn't seen as a reason to step in, especially in the Ozarks, where self-reliance and independence were core values. Even those nearest to the center, like Catherine Crawford, faced steep walls blocking real action. As Eliza's sister, Catherine held no legal right to demand access to her niece and nephew or to force a fuller probe of her sister's vanishing. In her journal, she vented her anger at the limits of her standing. If Eliza were merely property gone missing, the law would take greater interest. But a woman who might have chosen to leave, that is considered her right, regardless of how uncharacteristic such an action would be. Dr. Elaine Foster, a criminologist who folded the Whitlock case into her 1980 study of rural homicide trends, remarked that the remote setup of Ozark communities spawned ideal conditions for what she dubbed invisible crimes, violent acts that go unfound because of geographic remoteness and cultural forces. In city settings, Foster wrote, disappearances are more likely to be noticed and questioned. Multiple social connections create a network that makes complete erasure difficult. But in regions like the Ozarks in the early 20th century, a person could effectively vanish with minimal social disruption, particularly women whose social identities were often defined primarily through their husbands. Foster claimed the 4-decade lag in discovering Eliza's fate wasn't just an investigative shortfall, but a systemic blindness to certain breeds of violence. The story Thomas Whitlock spun, that his wife had ditched her family, was easily swallowed because it fit existing tales about women's fickleness and the hardships of frontier life. She wrote, the alternative explanation, that a husband had murdered his wife, was both more disturbing and more difficult to address within the available legal and social frameworks. It was simpler for all concerned to accept the abandonment narrative. The very physical stage of the Ozarks played a pivotal part in both the crime and its cover-up. The rough land, with its deep hollows, thick woods, and limestone caverns, has always offered hiding spots for those aiming to duck notice. During Prohibition, these same traits made the region prime for moonshine operations. In the Whitlock case, the Homestead's cut-off spot, nestled in a tight valley hemmed by steep hills, guaranteed that strange doings would pass unseen. The punishing winter of 1911 to 1912, with its heaps of snow and freezing cold, further slashed the odds of surprise visitors who might have spotted troubling signs. Professor Matthews, in his property study, noted that the limestone, heavy soil of the area had serendipitously saved evidence that might have otherwise vanished. The alkaline makeup of the soil, paired with the fairly dry air inside the collapsed root cellar, set up conditions that preserved both the diary and, to some extent, Eliza's remains. He wrote, in more acidic soils or in locations with greater moisture, decomposition would have been more complete, potentially eliminating the possibility of identification decades later. This preservation of evidence allowed the truth to eventually emerge, bringing a measure of resolution to a case that might otherwise have remained an unsolved disappearance. When Walter and Ruth Simmons stumbled on Eliza's diary in 1952, they sparked the probe that at last exposed what had happened on that lonely homestead 4 decades earlier.